Hey everybody, we're going to talk about chapter 4.2, all about developing the entity relationship diagram. So this process of developing the diagram is actually iterative, right? You want to build a little bit and check it, and build a little bit and check it, and build a little bit and check it. Because what we're trying to do is trying to get all of that business process, all of the business rules, everything from all the different departments in the business together essentially in one picture. And that's kind of difficult to do. Especially on your first pass, right? It's hard to do on your second pass or the third pass. So the idea is we're going to build this out and then we're going to check it. We're going to bring it back to our users and we're going to say, okay, are we appropriately capturing all the information that you said we need? And do we have all of those business rules in here? Are all the relationships correct? Are the participations correct? Do we have all the attributes? Right? And we're going to need to take it through this step by step by step and see, are we going to be able to capture everything that we need? Again, because data really drives our businesses today. So if we don't have a way to capture that data, we're going to be missing out. So ideally, you start with this nice narrative. And the narrative helps you guide you in the process. So once we have the narrative, then from there, we start finding the business rules. Right? And maybe we need to go talk to people for this. Right? And typically, you don't want to just talk to the managers. You want to make sure you're talking to the actual people who do the actual work. Because the manager might imagine it happens one way, but the people actually doing the work might tell you it works a different way. From there, then, we're going to identify our entities and the main relationships Once we know what the entities and the relationships are from these business rules, right, that kind of are supporting the narrative here, then we can start developing our first pass. So we get our first pass entity relationship diagram, or ERD. And at this point, conceptual is fine, right? It's nice to start thinking about implementation, but you don't want to spend a lot of time getting through all the weeds of building out the implementation model just to find out that something when you take it back to the business doesn't make sense. So again, we'll kind of focus conceptually on this level, and then we'll take it back and check it. Right? We're going to make sure that it actually matches what we need. Okay? Then we can go through and we can identify, make sure we have all the attributes. Right? When we're checking it, did we miss any attributes? Do we have the right primary keys? Do we have the right foreign keys? Right? Are we defining those relationships? Right? What's the participation? Right? How are we relating all of these pieces of information here? And we're just going to go through, check it, and just kind of repeat, revise and review, revise and review, revise and review. So the rest of this section actually takes us through the process of designing, and they use the tiny college example. And that's a fine example. Well, let's try a different example, though, to see if we can't get, we'll do this with the different examples that when you read through the text and you see tiny college, hopefully having seen it a second time is going to make a little bit more sense. So we're going to look at, we're a company that sells widgets. Right, so we'll buy widgets from our vendors. Maybe we'll assemble them into other pieces here, put some widgets together to make bigger widgets that we then sell to people. And it doesn't really matter too much. So what we need here then is we need to identify, we have customers, right, who buy things from us. So as we're kind of talking about the narrative here, right, you kind of, okay, here's a noun, so that's possibly an entity, right? We have our sales staff. So maybe sales staff is different. Maybe we need to know information because there might be some kind of relationship between sales staff and customers. And then maybe we have our manufacturing. Sorry, I really got to lift this pen. If I lift it, it comes out a lot better. We have manufacturing, right? And that might be an entity depending, right? We have the products or the widgets that we sell. Widgets. And then we have vendors that we buy the widgets from, or where we buy components to build the widgets, right? Any sort of, maybe we'll say we assemble everything, right? Maybe we need to get a lot of different components to turn into a big widget that we're going to sell, right? So we need to see that sort of information. And then we have management in here. You might have HR in here. We might have payroll, right? All those other sorts of functions, right? Lots of other things that happen in the business. So for now, we're going to kind of leave off a lot of this employee stuff. There's nothing wrong with it, but let's focus on some of this other sort of relationship here. So we know that our customers, right, are going to have a bunch of attributes. So we look at, say, the customer entity here. What are they going to have? Well, they're going to have name, right, which should probably be broken out between first and last. They're going to have a phone or an email. And then how to identify a customer, right? Maybe we just use an ID. Sure, we could do an ID. We'll say, hey, that's our primary key. Sure, no problem here. And we'll start thinking about, well, what fields are required and what fields are optional, right? The more information you have about the customer, the better. But if we don't know their phone number, if the only thing we deal over email, maybe that's fine. Maybe that's optional. And then we know that customers, then we want to have them buy our widgets. Right? So we want a widget to be bought by many customers, and we want a customer to buy many widgets. Now, you can be a customer without buying widgets, so that should be optional. And you can be a widget without being sold yet, so that should be optional. And again, this is many to many. We know this will be a problem later on when we actually start trying to implement this, but that's fine for now. No big deal. And then a widget is then made up of a bunch of things that we get from a vendor. So widgets might have components then, right? So a widget might be made up of components, right, that we buy from a vendor. So a widget is made up of a bunch of components. A vendor then can sell us a bunch of these components, right? So one vendor can sell us many components, but one component will probably only come from one vendor. And again, they can be in our system as a vendor optionally. Now, the widgets probably need to be at least one component. So we might say that one's required, right? We can't sell something that isn't made out of something, right? So maybe we buy just one component and that's the entire widget and we just sell it without doing any manufacturing. Maybe we need to assemble some of those components. So that can all, kind of depend on what's happening in here. All right, so we've got vendor, we've got components, we've got widget, and we've got customer. Then we need our sales staff in here, right? So we've got our sales. We'll say, hey, one salesperson can work with many customers, probably optional. Again, right, we might start a new salesperson, they're not assigned to anybody, but one customer should have one salesperson assigned who's their primary contact for the company. So we can kind of see this particular relationship across all of these entities. And again, widgets, we probably have an ID here for identifying them. We probably have a name. Widgets probably have a price. Same with components, we'd have an ID, a name. Right, even the components might even have a price, right? How much we're buying those from the particular vendor. Vendor would have an ID, a name, contact info, right? All that good stuff here for vendor. And we'll go through. In sales, again, sure, ID, name, whatever here. No big deal. Maybe this might even link out to our employee table where we have all the list of employees. That's okay. So we'll go through and we'll look at all of these, and then we start gathering all the attributes, start thinking about what keys they need to have here, and kind of refine the model, right? So sure, we've got IDs. Again, I'm a big fan of IDs in every table. Doesn't necessarily have to be that, but that's a nice, unique identifier that you know here. Right. So then to solve this many-to-many relationship, right? This idea of a customer will buy many widgets will be bought by many customers. Maybe we'll have an invoice, right? When I say, okay, if they're going to buy something, we'll create this invoice here. So then invoice then is going to have our customer ID, and it'll have the widget ID. But this all by itself, it is a weak entity in that you don't have an invoice without a customer. Right? One customer will have many invoices optionally, and one widget will be in many invoices optionally. Like this solves this relationship, so it's weak in that sense. But we don't necessarily need to have the primary key be the customer ID and the widget ID. That actually won't even work for us because you want your customers to buy your parts over and over again. You want them to buy more widgets. So if you said, hey, the primary key is only the composite key of customer ID and widget ID, we wouldn't be able to enter another invoice for them. That's not going to work. So in that sense, you don't want to be using those fields there if it doesn't make sense. Where with the college model that we looked at, where you can only enroll in a single section, right, one time, that makes sense. You don't want to be allowed to enroll in the same section more than once, right? That's silly. So just kind of depends. So again, we probably have an ID field here, and this is part of that. We'll check it and refine it and see what makes sense. Have that ID. We're going to have probably prices, right? Because you want to make sure we have the price at the time it was sold. We probably have a date in here. Because if you update the price of the widget and say, hey, now we're changing our prices, we're charging 10% more now, it's going to mess it up unless we've saved the price in the invoice. Our customer is going to be unhappy when they say, oh, hey, how much do I owe you, by the way? And we run a new invoice, and it has today's price instead of the price of when they bought it. They're going to be upset with us. So we can start refining it, going through this and checking our attributes, checking our keys, checking the relationships, trying to see, okay, are we required? Is it optional? What's the relationship here between all of our entities? Right, and then again, from crow's foot or the UML notation, I like the UML notation with the, instead of the crow's feet, you do like 1 to many, 1 to n, right? If we want multiple, or star, if our UML, like stars, right? 1 to star, right? You're going to have an invoice for at least one item, sure. Right, this sort of thing. So you can check the examples here for either kind of notation. But the main difference, right, is that the conceptual model is different from an implementation model because we've solved these many-to-many problems. So hopefully you get a chance to talk about those in the discussion, work through and see, hey, what other information do we even need to store? What other pieces of data do we need to store in that joining table to see, oh, okay, this is, actually makes a lot of sense here because I need the date, I need the price, I need this other piece of information here when I'm storing all of this information here for us.